Hi everyone, I'm Chris Mandeville and I'm excited to be back here with Pikes Peak Library District teaching everything you need to know to write a novel, at least everything that I think you need to know to write a novel. Let's go ahead and share some slides so we can talk about what it is we're going to cover today. Here we go. So I wanted to mention that I do have a handout for this class. It doesn't provide you with the information that I talk about in this class. It's a list of resources for you for further study on the topics that we discussed last week and this week in this class. And those topics are listed right there on your screen. So last week we covered the story idea and genre, story structure, story planning and plotting, and character arc. As you can see, we have a whole lot of stuff we're going to cover today, and we're going to start with conflict and tension. But before we do, I want to mention again that we're going to be covering a large amount of material at a high overview level, and we're going to be going pretty fast. My goal here is to introduce you to these topics that you can then take for further study later as it suits you and your writing and your schedule. Just want to introduce you to concepts so that they're part of your awareness and you can start building your toolbox of writing tools that you like to use. If you have a question, I really want to know and I want to answer all of your questions, but I'm going to have you hold those questions until I ask for them. We'll do at least 2 Q&A sessions. My plan is to do one at the end of like the first section and then another one at the end of the class. And I will answer questions on topics that I'm discussing during the class. And then at the very end, if you have questions about me as a writer or the writer's life or any other topic that I haven't covered, I will open up the floor to all of your questions and answer them the best I can. So go ahead and turn off your video. I will not be able to see you or hear you during this workshop. But if you want to communicate with me or with our leader, Melissa, you can do that via the chat. Alrighty, so let's get started on conflict and tension. Sometimes conflict and tension are used interchangeably, these literary terms, but they're not the same thing. Conflict is defined as opposition, a problem, an opponent that your character faces. It's what gets in the way of your character getting what they want, reaching their goals. Tension is defined as mental or emotional strain, fear, worry, the threat of conflict. And your character probably feels tension throughout the book when he or she or they face conflict. But in the literary sense that we're going to talk about today, I define tension as what the reader feels when the character faces conflict or problems. So when the reader is worried or concerned about what the character is facing, then that is what I call tension in a story. Now, I mentioned that they're not the same thing, conflict and tension, but they do similar work. They both create a sense of immediacy, urgency, and the ability for your reader to empathize with the character. Conflict and tension work together to heighten the reader's emotional involvement in the story and keep the reader turning pages. I do want to mention if your microphone is live, go ahead and mute that so that we don't have any interference for the recording. So when you create tension in your book, you want to do this so that the reader is engaged and keeps turning pages. And you create tension by having your character face conflict. Through this conflict, you will raise questions in your readers' minds like, who's going to win this encounter? What happens if the protagonist loses? Who is going to be changed by the outcome of this conflict and how? And I'm talking about not just the overall conflict of the book, but every scene should have conflict of some sort. In every scene, your character should be trying to get something that relates to their bigger goal of the whole book. So every scene, your character faces some sort of conflict, big or small, and hopefully your reader feels tension, wondering what the outcome of that conflict is going to be. And then that will keep the reader turning pages, which is what we all want, is we want our readers to be engaged and turning pages until the end. I do have a little caution for you about tension. If you keep your story at a constant high level of tension, your readers will eventually become numb to that to some degree, and it will not be as effective to keep them turning pages and keep them engaged. So you want to have your tension ebb and flow throughout the book by having your character solve problems and win, have a good outcome to the conflict, and mix that in with having them not solve problems and not win, and raise the tension and lower the tension, but never have it vanish entirely. You want to keep some tension on that string that keeps your reader going from the beginning of the book to the end of the book. Tension is one of the most neglected areas by beginning writers. And by thinking about the simple question, what is my reader worried about? It will vastly improve your novels. So here are some examples from movies. And I'll mention again, like I did last week, that people who teach about writing novels will often use movies to illustrate examples or concepts, because it's much more likely that you all have seen at least one of these movies. Whereas if I picked 4 books that I love and have read, it's likely, because there's so many books, that you may not have read them. So I pick films that are very popular in pop culture in the United States and Canada. So take a look at some of these movies and think back to ones that you've seen: Back to the Future, Hunger Games, Titanic, Jurassic Park. Hopefully you've seen at least one of these. And share with me in the chat, what do you remember being worried about when you were watching that movie? If you'd like to share it in the chat, I'm going to open up my chat here so that I can see. I do see a note in the chat. I'm going to talk about this while you're putting in your ideas about these movies. I have a handout that I mentioned at the beginning of this talk. This handout was sent out last week, but I have updated the handout based on a conversation we had in our class last week about characters who are differently abled or in some way different from sort of the mainstream archetypal hero or heroine. So I added to my handout some resources that will help all of us to explore characters who are differently abled or in some way different than what we consider the mainstream in pop culture. So Melissa's sharing, for Titanic, she was worried about who will survive. Yeah, because we knew that Rose survived in Titanic because of the frame story around it, that you have the modern day story where Rose is old and looking down at the wrecked Titanic from the many years after it sunk. And so we know Rose survives, but who else of all these characters survived the sinking of the Titanic? There are hopefully lots of things that you, as the consumer of this fiction, were worried about throughout the movie, and so that you were carried through from scene to scene. And one of the important things about these things that readers are worried about is that we as writers want to pay them off. We want to answer their questions and allay their fears periodically, right? So we keep raising questions in the reader's mind, the consumer's mind, having new conflicts and new things to worry about, at the same time paying off some of the old questions and old fears. And that helps to build trust between the writer and the consumer of the story, so that the consumer is confident that, okay, at the end of this story, I'm going to have a payoff. I'm going to get the answers to all of my questions. So for homework, if you'd like, A great exercise is to go back to books or films that you really enjoyed, especially ones where you were really engaged or you remember feeling a lot of tension. Try to figure out how the writer created that tension. There are lots of ways to create tension in a story. A ticking clock is a very good example of something that raises the tension because the more time that passes, the more imminent danger is. You can also have very, very high stakes, very personal stakes. You can have great odds against the hero. All these are things that raise tension. A really interesting technique that you might come across in watching a movie or reading a book is that the writer might let the reader, the consumer, know something that the hero, the protagonist, doesn't know. And that's a very, very interesting way of creating tension. So if the reader knows that on the other side of that door is a monster, but the protagonist doesn't know and is getting ready to open the door, the reader will feel more tension than if the reader didn't know what was on the other side of the door. So something to think about. You can up your you. I'm sorry, I'm just reading the message there. You can up your game by paying attention to what other writers have done in creating tension. Thanks for letting me know that that was set up incorrectly so we can fix that. There's no need for you to see all my notes to myself. And that way your slide view is a lot bigger. All right, so let's move on to the next slide, which we are going back to our topics. So we've covered conflict and tension, and I know that was quick, down and dirty. And that's how I'm going to cover pretty much everything we talk about today. So you're likely to have questions. Save those questions and I'll be sure to address them. And remember that in your handout of resources, there are lots of resources listed where you can learn more about conflict and tension when that becomes important to you in your writing process. Next, we're going to talk about point of view and tense. They are not the same. We're going to address them separately, even though they work together. Point of view is the perspective from which the story is told. It's the narrator's position in relation to the story. It is who is telling the story. First person, second person, and third person are points of view. And in the biz, we call it POV for short. So we have different points of view or POVs that are shown here with some popular examples. Harry Potter is told in the third person. Harry ran home. That's he, she, they is your subject. Hunger Games is told in the first person. I ran home. I am telling the story. I talk about other people as he, she, they, but the narrator, the narration voice is I. That's the perspective. Now here's a weird one, second person. You may not have ever read a book that's written in second person. It goes like this. You ran home. The writer brings the reader or the listener or the audience, it's kind of harder to do in a film than in a book, brings the reader into the story by talking directly to them. You ran home. It's very unusual and not done very frequently. We're going to dig into each of these just a little bit. For third person point of view, there are two types, omniscient and limited. In both, the story is told by that invisible narrator who is not a part of the story. And the narrator refers to the characters, as I mentioned, as he, she, or they. There is no I except in dialogue when characters are speaking. This omniscient narrator knows exactly what's going on in multiple characters' minds and gives the reader access to anyone's thoughts, feelings, or actions at any time. This type of point of view was much more prevalent in literature in the past than it is currently. So an example here is Dune, which I know we have a movie coming out soon, but the book itself was written by Frank Herbert in 1965 is when it was published. And in Dune, the narrator slips between multiple characters' minds on the fly. For example, in chapter 15, we, the reader, enter the minds of 3 characters in just the span of 10 paragraphs. in contrast to omniscient, is limited or close third person POV, much more common in today's fiction. It is still he, she, they, but it feels like first person, like somebody is personally narrating this and telling you the story, because in close third, the reader is seeing the story from behind the eyes of a character. So the reader knows in close third what that one character, that one perspective character is thinking, feeling, seeing, and doing from behind their eyes. Now, some books that are written in close third will have multiple characters that are perspective characters, multiple POVs in one book, which means that in one scene, the reader's behind Jim's eyes, and in another scene, the reader's behind Joe's eyes. The key difference is that we're only in one character's perspective at a time. The character doesn't know what everyone is thinking. The reader only knows what that character knows. Hopefully that makes sense. And I will mention again that close third can feel very much to a reader like first person. And if you think about your favorite contemporary book that you've read, you might not even remember after reading it as the reader if it was told in first or third, because it feels very similar. Let's talk a little bit more about first person perspective. Again, it means the story is told from I. The narrator is saying I this, I that, not he, she, they, unless they're talking about other characters. For first person, there is both a limited and an omniscient version. The limited is far more common and probably far more familiar to everyone. And it's like the character is telling the story about themselves, and the reader only knows what that character knows. The character is sharing not only what happens, but what they're thinking and feeling. For example, a story could go like this, not in quotes, I went to a party, I met a cool girl. Hey, in quotes, I said, trying to act like I was cool too. So we have the scene from that character's perspective. We have what they said and what they thought. Moving now to first person omniscient, I mentioned it's very uncommon, and that's because it only works in specific circumstances when your narrator is a character in the story who is omniscient. Most humans are not omniscient. So I could see this coming up perhaps in a fantasy story. But we do have an example here of the book thief. And the reason that the omniscient first person POV works in the book thief is that the character that's narrating the story is the devil. And this supernatural character of the devil knows what people in the story are thinking. That character is omniscient. Another example is from The Lovely Bones by Alice Sebold. And she uses first person omniscience to relate events from the point of view of a young woman who has died. Since the character who is telling the story in first person is dead, that character is able to see and know everything, or at least things that live people can't know. So you don't need to worry too much about that. I just wanted to introduce it. Another POV I'm going to go over quickly that you also don't need to worry about is that second person POV, where the narrator speaks directly to you, the reader. Here's an example of what that might read like. You're just standing there. She comes along and kisses you, and you nearly faint. This point of view is rarely successful. And when it is, it works best in shorter works. Some examples of where it did work well enough to get published are Bright Lights, Big City, Half Asleep in Frog Pajamas, and The Night Circus that I showed you the cover of on a previous slide. The advantage is that you can speak to the reader directly as the writer, but the disadvantage is it's quirky and weird and awkward, and the longer it goes on, the more chance that it's going to feel awkward. It's not something that a reader often will be able to get used to. Most publishing professionals will advise you against trying it. And one of the reasons is you don't want the editor or agent or the reader who's reading your book to go, "Ah, they're just trying to imitate Tom Robbins. They're just trying to imitate Bright Lights, Big City." Because it's so specific, it would be easy to be thought of as a mimic. Let's talk for a quick second about mixed point of view. That's when some scenes are in first person and some scenes are in third person. Examples are Stephen King's Christine. Some parts are told in first and some in third. Now, frame stories that I mentioned briefly with Titanic, like The Notebook by Nicholas Sparks. A frame story is when there's a story within a story. Often, like with The Notebook and Titanic, you have somebody in present day who is the narrator. And that person is telling you, the reader, about something that happened in the past. And then scenes are shared from the past. So you have dueling stories going on. Now, when you have a frame story, it's pretty common for one POV to be present and one POV to be first person and one to be third person. And often it's the person in the present time who is telling in first person. And the scenes from the past or these flashback scenes are told in third. But that's not a hard and fast rule. So which point of view should you use? I think I've mentioned that the most common these days are first person and close third. If you choose one of those, you're in good shape. So just do what feels natural to you. They have very, very similar advantages. So there's really no real reason to pick one over the other. Just do what feels natural and comfortable to you. For me, for example, I wrote my post-apocalyptic in close third, but I wrote my time travel series in first. Now, for me, one of the things that sort of played into my decision to try first person is that my time travel is young adult. And young adult more often than other genres does first person, but it's not a hard and fast rule. There are plenty of young adult stories that are told in third person. So either way would have been acceptable and perfectly fine in today's marketplace. So I tried both for my post-apocalyptic and for my time travel, and I preferred the first person, so I chose that. Don't be afraid to try both. Write a scene in first, write the same scene in third, and see what works best for you. You can even try the other points of view that I talked about, but be aware that there may be limited appeal in today's marketplace. So if you are planning to sell your novel, that is something that you might want to consider avoiding. A quick couple of tips from me. Be consistent in whatever you decide to employ in your novel with point of view. And even if you're doing omniscient or close third or whatever you're doing, try not to mix points of view in a single paragraph. That's a convention that we have in fiction writing, that each paragraph is from one person's perspective. So there are a lot of times that you can buck the system and try something new and different. In this case, it would probably serve to confuse your reader if you don't follow that convention. So I'd strongly encourage you not to mix point of view in a single paragraph. Learn these techniques like this one that other novelists use by reading other novels. And start simple with your own work. It's no shame to start with one point of view for an entire book for your first novel. And be consistent. Yes, I realize I'm repeating this, but it bears repeating. Consistency internally within your own novel as to your point of view rules is very much appreciated by your readers. It makes your story a lot easier to track and a lot less work for them. They're able to really fall into the story and not think about the writing. In my critique group, we call that being on the raft. When the reader's on the raft, they're just going down the river with your story, experiencing the story, and not thinking about the mechanics. All right, back to our list of topics. We've covered point of view and tense. We've covered point of view, but now we're going to cover tense. They are related and they often get confused, not just by me, but by lots of writers and readers when we're talking about it. I'm hoping to make it very, very clear by letting you know that all tense means it's referring to the tense of the verb, past tense verbs or present tense verbs. A narrator can tell the story in past tense or present tense. You can mix and match narration or point of view styles and tense styles. We're going to talk about what's more commonly paired together and what is less commonly paired together. So in an example by John Hart, one of my very favorite authors, this book is called Iron House. It happens to be my favorite book by one of my favorite authors. I'm going to read you the opening so you can hear past tense. Michael woke, reaching for the gun he no longer kept by the bed. His fingers slid over bare wood, and he sat, instantly awake, his skin slick with sweat and the memory of ice. There was no movement in the apartment, no sounds beyond those of the city. The woman beside him rustled in the warm tangle of their sheets, and her hand found the hard curve of his shoulder. So in that story, it happens to be a third person POV. But what we're paying attention to here is it is past tense narration. He woke, his skin was slick, there was no movement. The woman beside him rustled, and her hand found the hard curve of his shoulder. Those are all past tense. Let's take a look at present tense. This is The Hunger Games by Suzanne Collins. When I wake up, the other side of the bed is cold. My fingers stretch out, seeking Prim's warmth, but finding only the rough canvas cover of the mattress. She must have had bad dreams and climbed in with our mother. Of course she did. This is the day of the reaping. Present tense happens to be first person, I, and she's saying I wake up, not I woke up. So that's the key difference. Michael woke, and Katniss, our protagonist in the Hunger Games, wakes. Woke, wake, same verb, past and present tense. Super easy. That's all tense is in referring to this literary term in fiction. YA happens to use more present tense writing than other genres. Currently, that's just a trend. There are plenty of YA stories that are told in past tense, though, so you don't have to worry that it's a convention that you must adhere to. I admit that it's a very odd thing to get used to writing in present tense if you are used to writing in past tense. So I was used to writing in past tense for my first published novel and for my previous unpublished novels. For my time travel trilogy, I wrote not only in first person, as I mentioned before, but in present tense. I tried it both ways. I tried past tense, I tried present tense, and for some reason, present tense just felt better to me as the writer for this story. So play around with it and find what works for you. So for a third person narrator, so third person point of view, he, she, they, not I, it's much more common to use past tense than present tense. Present tense feels super strange. So here's an example of present tense from third person present tense from Rabbit Run by John Updike. Boys are playing basketball around a telephone pole. So it's third person narration present tense. Boys are, not boys were. It feels to me anyway like there's somebody describing what's happening in a movie or in a book, describing it to you. Oh, these boys are playing basketball. Like you can't see it, but I can. These boys are playing basketball around a telephone pole. I find it very strange, and probably a lot of other people do too. It like puts distance between the reader and the story in a weird way. So you're not going to find a whole lot of stories told in third person present tense. With first person, there are lots and lots of stories told in first person present tense and lots told in first person past tense. All right, so let's move on. That's tense. That's all you need to know. Let's talk now about voice. I have 3 definitions of voice here relating to literary terms, the literary term voice. The first is voice is the author's style, the quality that makes his or her writing unique and which conveys the author's attitude and personality. There's also the definition: voice is the characteristic speech and thought patterns of a narrator. And there's also the definition that voice is the style in which a character thinks and speaks, as in dialogue in the story. All three of these things are voice, which makes it a little bit difficult to talk about voice, but you can see how they're all kind of related. Most typically, when we talk in literary analysis about voice, most typically, voice refers to the first thing, the author's voice. It's very hard to define voice, but you know it when you hear it or see it. I'm going to give you some examples so you'll believe me. In Blood on the Tracks by Barbara Nicholas, I'm going to read her first chapter, or the first page of her first chapter. Be thinking about how you would describe the voice in this piece. And then we're going to contrast it with another piece. The Burned Man. His life wasn't worth spit in a hard rain. For 2 weeks, he'd been camping under the 7th Street Bridge, smoking and dozing next to the slow roll of the Los Angeles River. Through the misery of dry heat days and blue neon light nights, he listened to the roar of traffic overhead and wondered how a man could shed the perilous weight of memory. Time and again, he imagined climbing the crumbling pylons of the bridge, folding his uniform neatly over the rail, and stepping naked onto the highway to let that roar take him down. After 15 days, and with his mind made up, he was standing on the bridge when his phone rang. His woman calling from Denver. I miss you, Tucker. Please come home. I can't. Bad has filled every part of me. There ain't room for nothing else. All right, so hold your thoughts on voice. And I'm going to read the first paragraph of Neverwhere by Neil Gaiman, the prologue. The night before he went to London, Richard Mayhew was not enjoying himself. He had begun the evening by enjoying himself. He had enjoyed reading the goodbye cards and receiving the hugs from several not entirely unattractive young ladies of his acquaintance. He had enjoyed the warnings about the evils and dangers of London and the gift of the white umbrella with the map of the London Underground on it that his friends had chipped in money to buy. He had enjoyed the first few pints of ale, but then, with each successive pint, he found that he was enjoying himself significantly less, until now he was sitting and shivering on the sidewalk outside the pub in a small Scottish town, weighing the relative merits of being sick and not being sick, and not enjoying himself at all. So, I know that my tone as a reader changed, but I would bet that you would be able to pick up on the difference in voice in these two pieces if I hadn't read it to you, if you just seen it on the page. Would anyone care to share in the chat how you would describe Nicholas's voice or Gaiman's voice, or how those two pieces compare and contrast? I think that Nicholas's voice is much more dark and serious. And even though the character Richard Mayhew in Gaiman's piece is experiencing something unpleasant, the voice is much more lighthearted and playful, not quite so serious and dark. So Deborah is sharing that the first one she found to be dark and heavy, like the old murder mystery writer who she's thinking of someone that she can't think of their name. And the second is lighter. Yeah, so voice is like pornography. You know it when you see it. And I think that voice is a really important component of being a novelist. It's one that for me, I had a really hard time identifying and embracing my own voice. And once I did, my fiction writing took off like crazy. It made a huge difference in the quality of my writing and how well it was received by others, and in my confidence in what I was doing. So with regard to this definition that voice is the author's style, you've probably heard the adage that no story is truly original, that you can't possibly write a novel that's truly original, that all stories have been told before, and your story is just a different retelling of an existing story. That may or may not be precisely true, but I will tell you one thing that isn't like everybody else's, that has never been done before, and that is your voice. Your voice is uniquely you. It may be sort of like one author, as Deborah was pointing out, or sort of like another author, or a mix of several authors, but it is uniquely you. So study voice in other writers to try to get a grip on it, try to get a handle on it. And if you want, for practice, you can try mimicking someone else's voice, not in something that you would publish, but in just practice for yourself. And by mimicking someone else's voice, you might be able to better identify your own voice. So try your best to identify your own voice and embrace it, because that is what makes your work unique in the marketplace. And it's what's going to help you find readers that love what you do. Briefly, we're going to talk about the third definition of voice, which relates to the voice of the character, specifically dialogue. So not the voice of the narrator, but the voice of your point of view character, which, yes, sometimes is the narrator. So your point of view character who's telling, either in third person or in first person, the story in that particular scene. When they speak to the reader in their thoughts and in voice, in dialogue, they're using voice. And there are rules to dialogue. And with dialogue, like with point of view, you pretty much want to stick with the rules, especially as a beginning writer or a beginning novelist. You may be experienced in other medium. So here are the rules, according to me. Dialogue must advance the story. Dialogue should have the tags or attributions, he said, not he commanded or said he. That's true for he, she, they, and I. You want to use I said, he said, not said I, said he. Or you can drop the attribution altogether and not use he said or I said, but instead use a beat of action to tag the dialogue. Instead of saying, don't touch that, he said, you could do, don't touch that, in dialogue quotes, he pointed at the red hot burner. So we still know as the reader that the person who said that dialogue is he, whichever the he character is in that scene. But we have more information conveyed besides just who said it. That tag is doing more work. That attribution is doing more work by telling you an action or a thought that's happening in the scene. When you write dialogue, leave out pleasantries like, how are you? Oh, I'm fine. Have you been? How's your mom? We talk like that in real life, but that does not move the story forward, which is one of the requirements of dialogue. So leave out the pleasantries as much as you possibly can while still having it feel authentic. Don't have your characters tell another character something that they already know. You'll see this in Star Trek. You'll see, as you know, Jim, this is how the transporter works. Well, Jim already knows how the transporter works. So what the author is doing there is using dialogue as a device to convey information to the reader that the characters already know. Don't do that, because readers are savvy and they find it false. They don't feel that it's authentic. So be authentic to your characters and don't have them say things that to somebody that other person already knows, unless you have a really good reason for it in the context of the story. In other words, don't use it just to convey information to your reader. Try not to use adverbs with your dialogue tags. You know, he said briskly, he said urgently. Try not to do that because it comes off as overtelling, overwriting. So use the emphasis within the dialogue. Don't! Exclamation point. Don't touch that. Or use your action tag to convey the urgency. Don't touch that, in quotes. He pointed at the red hot burner. You get the sense that it's urgent. You don't have to say he said urgently. Some famous writers use adverbs. J.K. Rowling in the Harry Potter series is a good example. She can get away with it because she's J.K. Rowling and it works for her. It might work for you, but as a newer writer, it's better to follow the rules than to buck the system. And that is a current modern day fiction writing convention. In older fiction, they used a lot more adverbs. In your dialogue, ignore grammar. People don't speak in complete sentences. They use contractions, they use partial sentences. Try to mimic that in your dialogue without getting too precise. Like, you don't want to listen to somebody's conversation in real life and then transcribe it. You want to listen to conversations and get the gist of what they're saying, and just put enough in your dialogue so that your reader gets the idea. Same with dialect. Like, if somebody's speaking with an accent, use very, very little of that to convey the accent or the dialect. Your reader will pick up on it and then will start filling it in for you. You don't have to do it all the time. Less is more. I skipped over match your character's vocabulary to his age, status, the time and place in which the story exists. That's pretty important for your readers to feel like your characters are real, that their dialogue is authentic, is if you match up how they're talking and the words they're choosing with who they are and where they are. So to test all this dialogue out, read it aloud to yourself and or have someone else read it out loud to you. You'd be surprised how either or both of those techniques helps you to get a better handle on your dialogue than simply reading it to yourself silently on the page. A couple quick dialogue mistakes that are pretty common, especially in newer novelists. Using too many tags or attributions that are not said. So instead of he said, you have he explained, she whined, they rambled. The cool thing about he said is that the reader starts to ignore it. It's almost a subconscious way of letting the reader know who's talking without bothering the reader. So if you have a whole lot of blah, 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 he said, blah, 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 he explained, blah, 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 he did this, he did that, he did the other thing, adverbs or different verbs. He said urgently, the reader is going to notice the writing. They're not going to be on the raft, just ingesting the story without paying attention to how it's conveyed. So use said. I promise it will disappear. So, and I mentioned too many adverbs. Misplaced tags. Misplacing a tag is a really common mistake, and it can be hard to find in your own writing. So this is where it can help to have somebody that you share writing with, where somebody can critique your work, give you feedback. Here's an example of a misplaced tag. What a mess. Lauren spilled coffee on her shirt. Or his voice was anxious. Where could Ellen be? What's wrong with these is they're in the wrong order. They're misplaced. If Lauren is talking about the coffee on her shirt being a mess, she has to spill it before she says, what a mess. If the other dialogue, if that male person was, if we wanted to know that his voice was anxious when he said, where could Ellen be? He has to say it first and then have the attribution, his voice was anxious. So pay attention to placement of attribution. Attribution is just another word for what we call a tag. You are attributing a piece of dialogue to a character. That's a dialogue tag or attribution. So, and finally, not following established methods of writing dialogue. I'll repeat it here that there are conventions, there are rules, and you are much, much, much better off if you want to have a successful novel that is received well and enjoyed by readers, if you follow the conventions, because readers are familiar with the conventions and it makes reading your story and getting into your story, getting on the raft so much easier. So learn what those conventions are. Pay attention when you're reading someone else's novel. I mentioned we're going quick. We're going quick. So setting. Setting is where and when your story takes place in time and space. And gone are the days when paragraph after paragraph in a story would convey the landscape and the weather. Nowadays, in modern fiction, we typically just get a few clues as to setting that are woven into the narrative, and they're not set apart as description all by itself. We're going to dig in just for a minute into Barb Nicholas's paragraph or page that we've already read. There is one paragraph that has a lot of setting, and that's the second paragraph. Let's take a look just at that. These elements of setting that I've identified, I highlighted in green. There's quite a lot of them in this paragraph. But when I was reading it, I didn't notice a lot of setting. Why? Why didn't it feel heavy in setting? Well, I think it's because of the parts that are highlighted in orange, the parts that relate to the character and how the character relates to the setting. So I'll read it to you with the highlights so that you can see what I'm talking about. For 2 weeks, he'd been camping under the 7th Street Bridge. That tells you about the character in relation to the setting. He'd been smoking and dozing next to the slow roll of the Los Angeles River. If we took out all of the character interaction and we just had a paragraph that had the setting in it, it's actually just one sentence long. For 2 weeks, he'd been camping under the 7th Street Bridge next to the slow roll of the Los Angeles River through dry heat days and blue neon nights with the roar of the traffic overhead. That is very setting heavy. So your writing will be better. It will be better received by your readers if you have each sentence do multiple things. Address character, plot, and or setting in every single sentence if you possibly can, rather than having just a sentence that addresses setting all by itself. In addition to my suggestion that you weave plot, character, and setting together in your sentences and paragraphs, I would also suggest the tip that making your setting integral and important to the plot and or the character makes your setting more meaningful. So set your story in a place that matters to the plot or that matters to the character, and it will be a much richer story for it. When you do provide setting details, sprinkle them in rather than giving us a whole heavy setting paragraph. It's digested better that way by your readers. When you are describing something, this is something that I was very surprised to learn as a newer novelist. It has more impact on the reader if you give one salient detail than if you provide a laundry list of details. So if you're describing the river, giving one detail about the river has a lot more impact than if you provide 7 or 3, because each one that you add into the sentence takes away some of the strength of the first one. So you're taking emphasis and spreading it out over 5 or 7 words instead of keeping all that emphasis on one description. So keep that in mind. And then limit repeating and reminding your reader of the details of the setting. There are 2 reasons for this. Your reader, I keep mixing those up. Your reader is pretty savvy, and your reader will remember these things and may get either annoyed by you repeating them, or if they didn't really internalize it the first time and they painted a different picture in their mind, they might be confused or annoyed when you bring up a detail that changes the picture in their mind of the setting. So set out your scene with a few salient details and don't reiterate those a lot unless they're really important. Say they're a clue in your mystery. And don't really hit your reader over the head with those details. They will paint a picture in their mind and they will just go down the raft on your story. You don't need to keep painting that picture over and over again. Okay, here we are at putting it all together. Again, this is going to be really quick, but you have resources in your handout to explore this further. We've covered all these components of story around a central idea. When you take character by itself, it's not a story. Conflict by itself is not a story. But when you link all these components together around a central idea, that's when you get a story. So the important thing about these story components, they don't come in when you're drafting your story, except perhaps in your subconscious. The idea is just to write your story without worrying too much about the component parts. The best way to pull all these elements together is to just let it happen organically. Because, like I said last week, even if you're new to the techniques of being a novelist, you're not new to story. You've been consuming story your whole life, and it is embedded and ingrained in your subconscious. So if you let go of all these shoulds and rules and components while you're writing your first draft and let it happen organically, you'll be surprised how many of these you include, probably all of them to a greater or lesser degree. So when you want to really focus on putting these elements together and how they interact and do you have them all, is in our next section, which is on editing and revision. But first, I want to remind you of something we talked about briefly last week, and that is taking your character and your plot and connecting them. Those are two really important components of your story, your character and your plot. And there are techniques for how you can connect them as you go through the plot points in your story. You can connect them to specific points in your character arc. So what happens in your story is plot. The way that your character changes through the story is the character arc. And these things have been married together by many people who teach about writing. Here's one example from Christopher Vogler's book, The Writer's Journey. He describes the hero's journey, which is plot, in conjunction to the hero's arc, the internal changes in the character. So you can check that out on your own if that appeals to you. For me personally, the tool that's helped me the most in putting together the different elements of story is called GMC, Goal, Motivation, and Conflict. Knowing this tool, using this tool has improved my fiction writing more than any other tool that I've ever used. The way GMC works is simple. It's really simple for such a complex and profound concept. Basically, you take a character. I'll start with my protagonist, Allie, in my time travel series. So for Allie, her GMC, what is her external goal for the whole story overall? You can do this before you write the story, or you can do this when you're in revisions, or you can be writing along and then get stuck and then address GMC to get unstuck. So for Allie, her external goal is to find her mother. Her internal goal is to matter, is to belong to people who love her, to have a family unit. Her motivation for finding her mother externally is that she's in the foster care system. Her mom disappeared. She's on the very last foster home before they ship her out of the city to a whole nother system. She's got to find her mother for that reason externally. Internally, she's motivated to find her mother because she doesn't want to believe that her mother would have left her willingly. She wants to believe that her mother loves her so much that she would never have left if she didn't have to. And if she finds her mother, she'll get the answer to those questions. So I do this for my main character, for my antagonist, for my secondary characters, any point of view character, goal, motivation, and conflict, which is what's getting in the way of what they want. And I do that not only for the book as a whole, but I do that for each scene. What does my character want in this scene? Why do they want it? And what's in their way, internally and externally? So I would suggest to you that on your own, explore GMC for some of your favorite books and movies until it becomes familiar to you so that you can use it on your own stories. Remember to do both internal and external. And remember to check the GMC for the book overall, as well as for each scene. You can learn more about GMC in this book, Goal, Motivation, and Conflict, The Building Blocks of Good Fiction by Deborah Dixon. I highly recommend this book. It changed my life as a writer, if I don't sound too dramatic saying that. But if you want a shortcut, I wrote a blog post about it. You can find it at the URL there, or you can find it on my website, chrismandeville.com, under tips and info for writers. I did a summary of GMC. And just so you know that it's accurate, and maybe to toot my own horn a little bit, Deborah Dixon, the author of the book, read my blog post and commented that I got it right. So, which was a huge boon for me, but also it's a boon for you because it can give you a shortcut if you are unable to find the book or you don't have time. Phew, okay, that's a whole lot of information that we've covered. I imagine y'all feel inundated and perhaps feel like you have a lot of questions. If you have questions, now is the time to bring them up. If you don't have questions, that's okay. We'll move right along. But if you do have questions, go ahead and type them in the chat. Let me know what questions are on your mind about what we've covered so far. If you want to hit topics that we haven't covered yet, let's hold those until the end. So while you're thinking of your questions, I'll just remind you what we've talked about. Last week, we talked about the story idea, where ideas originate, what types of story ideas there are. We talked about genre, which is a really important way to classify and categorize writing. It's important to readers so that they can choose books that they know they're going to want to read. Like if I want to read a mystery, I go to the mystery section. If I want specifically a crime detective or detective noir story, I can go to that subgenre of that mystery genre section. And in that way, I can find a book that meets my expectations. It should be important to you as writers because we want to make sure we meet reader expectations and that readers can find our books. That keeps our books getting purchased and keeps our readers happy and coming back for more. We talked about story structure, and that is the building blocks of story and how they're put together in, they can be in a linear fashion. The different components that we're accustomed to when we talk about novels. We talked about how to plan or plot out your story using some of those story structures and some other methods. Some people like to plan. We call those people plotters. Some people don't like to plan at all. They like to write by the seat of their pants. Those people are called pantsers, colloquially in the writing world. Most people I found are some combination of plotter and pantser. It's good for everybody to know these tools that we're talking about in this class, because whether you're a plotter and you use them in advance to plan your story, or you're a pantser and you write your whole story without thinking about them, they become very important in our next section, which is editing and revision. Some of the other tools we looked at: character and character arc and how to develop those. We've talked today about conflict, tension, how they're different, how they work together, why they're important. Point of view and tense, how they work together and how they're different, but work hand in hand, and how you might be able to choose yours. We talked about voice, your unique way of telling a story that is unique to you alone and makes you stand out and makes you special in the marketplace. And we talked briefly about setting, where and when your characters are in space and time. And very, very briefly, we talked about how to put those things together. Now, we're going to take all of those tools that we've now put in our writer's toolbox, and we're going to bring them to bear on the second draft of our story by looking at editing and revision. I don't see any questions, so I'm going to go ahead and move on to this section, and then I will have another time period at the end where you can ask me questions about anything. So let's say at this point, you've got your story drafted. You've got a beginning, a middle, and you've reached the end. Great job. You have written a novel. You are a novelist. You have a manuscript in your hand. But hang on, because it's not ready to be tied up in a bow just yet. Before it goes out into the world, you really should take another look at it. Clean it up, correct any problems that you find, polish it, and make it pretty. And importantly, you want to make sure you've addressed all the story elements we've talked about in this class to your satisfaction as the writer. That may mean you hit some heavier than you hit others, but you at least have done due diligence and thought about all these components of a novel, and then address them however you think is best, because you're the boss of your story. When we do that to our second draft, third draft, fourth draft, we are in the editing and revision stage. That is simply when you go back and revisit your story, change it, fix it, improve it to be the best story it can be. But before we dig into that, I want to talk a little about hats. Writing a rough draft and revising that draft are two very, very different things. They require two different mindsets, two different skill sets. And even though we're using the same tools in our toolbox, we use different parts of our brain, and we use those tools differently if we're drafting or if we're revising. Well, writing is creative and free and open and flowing and sweeping. Revising is focused on details. It's critical and unforgiving. If you're in the writer mindset, that's free and loving and everything is awesome, and you're trying to revise from that mindset, that can be a problem. You can be too forgiving. You can decide that you don't need to cut away any of your lovely words, what we in the business call killing our darlings. If you are in that mindset where everything is your darling and you can't get rid of anything, you can't do the job of cleaning up your story and making it better, because you're just too in love with the words you wrote. You're too attached to your story. Likewise, if you're in the editor mindset, when you're trying to draft, that is a huge problem too, because the editor is so critical. If you're trying to write a rough draft from the perspective of the editor, wearing the editor's hat, then you'll be too critical. Nothing you write will meet your satisfaction. Nothing will be correct. You'll judge and second guess and criticize everything you try to put down on the page. So it's really important to wear the right hat for the job, to be in the right mindset for the job. So when you're drafting, consciously put on your writer hat. Become solidified in that writer's mindset of everything is good and I love it all and it's fantastic. I'm going to write it all down. That's when you're drafting. But when your first draft is done and it's time to go back and edit it, put on that editor's hat where you can be critical and you can objectively say, you know what, that scene is not good. I either need to cut it or rewrite it. Or you can say, that is just a terrible description that I included there. So it requires, for me, an awareness of what it is I'm trying to do in the moment. Some writers hop back and forth between these two mindsets in the same page while they're writing. They write, they edit, they write, they edit. But I have found that of all the things that could get in your way for completing a rough draft of a novel and becoming a novelist, that wearing your editor's hat too often or wearing it unknowingly is the biggest thing that can stop you from reaching your goal, which is to complete a novel. So if you're getting stuck a lot or you're feeling unhappy with what you're writing, then perhaps it's time to take off the editor hat and really put that writer hat firmly on your head. If you're editing, if you are revising your novel and you're getting stuck, you can't make any changes because you're too in love with what your words and you think just everything's perfect, Time to put on a different hat, time to put on the more critical editor hat. So the bottom line here is complete your rough draft all the way through is my advice before you start revisions. So let's talk now about editing and revision. We often use those terms interchangeably, but there is a technical difference between them. When you revise your novel, you're looking at your novel as a whole. You're thinking about how the big component parts fit together. You can think of revision as revision, seeing your story with new eyes. When it's time for revision, we look at the story as a whole and we ask ourselves the questions: does the plot hold together? Is the character arc complete and satisfying? Are there any loose ends I left hanging out there? Are there any saggy or boring parts? Is anything missing from this book? When you're looking at editing, you're looking at the fine points: word choice, word order, cutting and adding words, refining, honing the prose. You do editing after revising. And the reason is pretty simple. You could edit your prose to where it shines and it's perfect. If you do that first, and then you look at the big picture and you realize, dang, I didn't need that chapter, I didn't need that paragraph, you wasted your time refining those because you're going to delete them. So look at the big picture first, revision, and make sure that all the component parts are where you want them and how you want them. And then move to the editing phase where you tinker with the words. A couple quick notes about professional editors. Basically, when you're talking about a professional editor, there are two types of editing. One is a developmental edit, and that is looking at the big picture of the story. A developmental editor does what I asked you to do when you're revising. Look at the big picture. A line editor or a copy editor does the fine tuning we talked about with editing, looking at word choice and word order and honing and refining and polishing. There is another level to professional book publishing with regard to editing and fixing up a novel, and that is a third stage, which is proofreading. The proofreader looks for spelling, typos, and errors of that nature. If you are going to have your book traditionally published, which means a publisher buys your manuscript, then the publisher hires these editors to work on your book. They pay for that. You don't pay for that as the writer if you are traditionally published. And then those other people who are professionals and experts in their field, they help you during the stages of editing and revision. But that doesn't mean you shouldn't revise and edit on your own before you go out into the world and try to find a publisher. You should still do the best you can do. And that's because if it's not your best, the publisher might not pick you up, might not buy your manuscript, and then you'll never have the advantage of that publisher provided editor. So do your own work, do the best job you can do editing and revising. Now, if you're not interested in being traditionally published and you're interested instead in self-publishing, these editors who work for the publisher, you don't get to use them. But the good news is there are freelance editors. There are professional editors who work for hire. And if you are self-publishing, you would seek out, I hope, these professionals and pay them for their work, and they will help you make your book better. You should still make it as good as you can on your own, because the more work the editor has to do, the more you have to pay them. Now, I hope that if you self-publish, even if you cannot afford an editor or don't want one, I hope you will at least employ a proofreader to make your book as professional and polished as it can be. Another quick word about critique groups, because critique groups can help you refine your work at both the developmental or big picture level and at the fine-tuning level. And critique groups shouldn't cost you any money. A critique group is when you get together with one or more other novelists who are doing what you're doing, and you share your work and you share advice and you help each other. Now, most often, critique group members fall into the line editing. It's very easy to do if you're sitting with a manuscript in front of you and a red pen. But a critique group can be so much more valuable if the critiquers look at the big picture first. So rather than correcting word choice, looking at questions like, does this hold together? Do I understand it or is it confusing? Is it repetitive? Am I on the raft? So critique can be extremely, extremely valuable at the revision level. Okay, so some examples of tasks and where they fall on the list, if it's editing or if it's revision. Revising tasks include things like making sure your character's GMC is clear and consistent, making sure every scene advances the plot and or the character arc. I've mentioned that a couple times. Every scene, every bit of dialogue should be related to your plot and or your character arc, which is why GMC can be so valuable as a tool. You want to keep the reader asking questions, and you want to pay off those questions periodically and bring up new questions. In that way, building trust with your reader that you're reliable and you're going to pay them off at the end. And also pulling them along in the story and keeping them turning pages. During revision, you want to remove unnecessary big picture items, and you want to make sure you do have all the ones that are necessary. This is when you're going to address voice. Did you use your own voice? Were you consistent there? You're going to look at theme if you're aware that you have one. We don't always in commercial fiction writing think about theme, but in literary writing, that's a huge component. You want to look at point of view and tense. Were you consistent within your own story? You want to look at conflict and tension and pacing. You want to look at all the things that we've covered in this workshop during revision. Then during editing, you're going to address things like paragraph order, refining sentences, making the correct word choice. That's when you get out your thesaurus. You want to delete unnecessary repetition, reduce adverbs and adjectives as much as you can, and also exclamation points. We haven't really talked about those, but exclamation points are a crutch that writers sometimes use to give emphasis, and you don't have to use those. You have other ways you can provide emphasis. Importantly, during both revision and editing, you're going to focus a lot on the chapter beginnings and endings, and especially the very first chapter of your book. We're going to talk a lot more about that because it's so important. And then, of course, in editing, you're going to look at grammar, spelling, typos, that sort of thing. Here's my tips for you. It may be a bit overwhelming to do revisions because of the vast scope. My best tip is to do revisions in stages or layers, going through the manuscript from beginning to end, looking at just one component, like, for example, pacing. Does this mean you might do a dozen passes through the manuscript, revising it before you even get to line editing? Yes, it does. It can. As you get more skilled at this and more practice at this, you might be able to do 2, 3, 4 different components on each pass. You might be able to do all the components all at the same time in each pass. But as a newer novelist, a way to make it feel less overwhelming and a way to make sure you get the job done is to do it in stages or layers. A few other quick tips. Show, don't tell means use sensory details and internalization to reveal your story rather than using exposition and summary to explain your story. So be in the moment. Don't distance your reader from the story by explaining it. But I said mostly show, don't tell, because sometimes it's important that it's okay to tell something because it's more expedient, and not everything in your story has equal importance. So the stuff that's really important, show, don't tell, and stuff that's less important, sort of more tangential or more throwaway things, you can tell on those for expediency. Next, I've mentioned this several times because it's really important. Double check during the revision stage that you have all the scenes and all the components in the story in the best possible order for revealing your story. And remember to check for sequels to the scenes. As a reminder of something we talked about last week, a scene is when something happens to your character. And a sequel is when they are processing it emotionally, mentally, and making a decision about what to do next. So it's the character's emotional reaction to what just happened. Often, a scene relates to plot and the sequel relates to the character arc. Be sure to delete scenes, paragraphs, dialogue that don't move the plot or the character arc forward, or repurpose them so that they do that work. And of course, you should delete anything that's boring. If you're bored with it as the writer, chances are good that the reader is bored with it. So rather than describing every detail of me walking in the door to my office, sitting down at my desk, and setting up my computer for this talk, if I were writing that scene, I could just start it while I'm starting the talk. Or I could quickly summarize rather than showing it. I could tell she walked through the door and sat down at her desk and opened up Zoom. That's real quick. You don't have to show every single thing. So fix or delete boring writing. Phew, okay, that was revision. Now just a quick aside, editing tips and techniques. So that was revision, this is editing. And then we're gonna move on to doing some actual revising as an example. So when you're editing, try to choose active verbs, not passive. Use strong verbs, like instead of saying she ate it, you could say she scarfed it down. Scarf is a much more evocative and strong verb than eat. Reduce your use of adjectives and adverbs as much as you can without ruining your style. Be ruthless in this editing stage at cutting unnecessary words. For example, if you said she sat down, well, where else is she going to sit but down? You could just say she sat. You don't need the word down. Same with she nodded her head. What else is she going to nod? Just she nodded. So search and destroy is a method where you literally use the search function of your word processor to seek out words you want to delete or replace. Words that you know you repeat too many times, or crutch words that you use when they're not really necessary, like the word really, like the word just. That's one of my crutch words. So I'll do search and destroy and find all the occurrences of just, and I will delete or change every single one of them, except where just is the exact right word. You can also search for common mistakes that you know that you make. Like if you often will use a homonym, like there and there, and you commonly use the wrong one when you're typing just because you're not thinking about it. Or if there's a word that you commonly misspell, do search for those. This is also a good way to check for consistency in your story. Did you spell your character's name the same way every time? If you changed your character's name somewhere along the line, make sure you search for both names to make sure you didn't miss any. And on that note, if you do a global replace, like let's say your character's name is Chris, C-H-R-I-S, like my name, and you decide, I'm not going to use that name. I don't like that name. I'm going to use the name Kathy. And you do a global search and replace. Tell your computer to replace every instance of the word Chris with the word Kathy. And it does it automatically behind the scenes and you don't watch it happen. Be careful because you have just changed the word Christmas to Kathy-tmas. So be careful when you do global replace. When you're editing, it's a good time to look at your taglines, your attributions, and hone those. Remember to get rid of as many he said, she said, I said, non-saids as you can. Use a good balance of said versus an attribution that's an action or a thought. Try not to have patterns because readers will notice patterns. Like if you did he said, and then an attribution of he walked to the door or he thought this. If you have patterns in your construction, readers will pick up on that and it makes them notice your writing. You want your writing to disappear so that all they notice is story. And I want to bring up exclamation points again. Same with italics. You are better than that. You can find other ways for emphasis besides exclamation points and italicizing words. Give it a shot. Trust yourself that you can do that and not use those crutches of exclamation points and italics very often. Some writers will tell you that you should only use one exclamation point per story. Some writers actually go by that rule. Now, an exclamation point in dialogue is more acceptable than not in dialogue. But look out for those exclamation points and see what you can do to avoid them. All right, I promised we were going to do some editing. We're going to talk about one of the biggest edits you can possibly do when you go from your first draft to your second draft and doing your revisions. And that is finding the right place for your story to begin. When you're drafting, when you're rough drafting, you don't have to think about that. Just sit down and write. Write whatever comes to mind. Just write. And as you're writing and writing and writing, don't second guess your words. Don't censor your words. Don't try to pigeonhole them into, oh, now I'm going to do setting. Oh, now I'm going to do this. Try your best to just let it flow. If you do that successfully, you'll get a lot more words on the page. You'll make a lot of progress. But when you go back and look at it in the revision stage, you're going to find a lot of unnecessary stuff. Especially at the beginning of your book, you're likely to find a lot of writing pertaining to you as the writer discovering and deciding things about your character, your setting, and your plot. Often, you'll find when you look at your rough draft that you have pages and pages and pages of backstory and setup and figuring stuff out before the real story starts. And this can be true no matter how much of a plotter you are, how carefully you plot out your story. You can still end up with a lot of extra stuff at the beginning of the story that will not be the best way to introduce your reader to your story. So it's your job, only when your novel is completely done and you've written the end, it's your job to go back and look for all that stuff at the beginning that is not necessary and excavate out your true beginning of your story. Let's talk about that a little bit more. Where is the right place to begin your novel? Well, you should start at the mattering moment. That is when things change for your character. It's the beginning of a different path in their life. Without this change, their life would go on like normal. And that would make for a pretty boring story. We're telling a story of something significant happening to this character. So you want to find that mattering moment at the beginning of your story and hone in on where exactly your story begins. There are a lot of tools out there to help you figure this out. We're not going to be able to figure it out for you here today. But I would recommend that you rely on that story structure tool, especially the hero's journey or a version of that works for you, to help you identify the steps in your story and where exactly you should begin your narrative. Because where you begin your story can make or break your novel. And that's because if you don't hook your reader with the beginning of your story, because you've got all this backstory and exposition, if you don't get to the beginning of the story and hook them into your story, they are not as likely to continue reading. So you want readers to read your story. So it's important to find the beginning. So in finding that sweet spot, you want the perfect amount of backstory and setup before that mattering moment, not too much and not too little. So I'm not saying your mattering moment should happen on page 1. So think about exactly what do you need? What's the minimum you need before that mattering moment for your readers to understand what's happening and be engaged with what's happening? Again, most writers cut a whole lot of stuff out of the beginning of their draft to find that mattering moment. But I have known a couple of writers who don't have the mattering moment in their story. They started their drafting later after the mattering moment happened. And those writers need to go back in and write those scenes. But that's a very rare occurrence. Typically, writers will write a whole lot of stuff that needs to be cut. So looking at the perfect beginning, there is no formula for how to figure out exactly what is the perfect beginning for you. But I have developed a sort of formula for how to make your first page work once you have figured out your mattering moment and where your story begins. And again, making that first page perfect is important, because if page 1 isn't good, your reader might never turn to page 2. And that is true if you're submitting to an editor or agent, or if you're self-publishing. So there's no formula, but there's kind of a formula that I made. First, let's talk about the goals of that first page more specifically. Number 1, the first page should hook the reader and make them want to know more. This often has to do with plot, specifically with some sort of conflict that the reader wants to know the resolution to. But that hook can have to do with anything. And we're going to talk more about hook later. Number 2, your first page should ground the reader in time and space. Remember that setting. So there should be some amount of setting on your first page so your reader isn't lost. And number 3, it should engage the reader emotionally. Usually this has to do with connecting in some way with the protagonist character on that page. So plot, setting, and character all need to be up front right there on page 1, in my opinion. Now, that's a lot to do on one page, but that's not all. There's more. So this plot, character, setting, with plot being plot/conflict, I call that the trifecta. And in addition to that trifecta, those 3 elements that work together in harmony, I've identified these other elements that I think can help a first page be successful. Tension. Remember, that's what the reader feels when the character experiences conflict. Genre indicators. We talked a lot about genre in last week's class. I personally think it's important to have some indicators of the genre in the first page so that your reader verifies that they're reading the right book. So let's say that you categorized your book as a mystery when you put it in Barnes & Noble and you put it up on Amazon. But on that first page, what your reader gets, instead of a modern day mystery, they get dinosaurs or dragons. They're going to be confused. They're going to be maybe a little unhappy. Maybe they're not even going to turn the page to the next page because they think, this isn't a mystery. I must have picked up the wrong book. You don't want your readers doing that. So genre indicators are important. Hook, again, we're going to talk more about it later, but basically a hook is anything that captures the reader's attention enough that they turn the page. Voice, we talked about, that is your unique way of telling a story. And that alone can hook a reader. Your unique voice might be all it takes. Foreshadowing the ending is another component I listed because it can really make the beginning of your book better, but it is not a required element in my opinion. Sometimes it really works. And then another thing that is not required, but it really can be awesome when you do include it, is a great first line. Now, we don't have time to look at all of these today, but we're going to go through some of them, starting with a great first line. So I'm going to read this first page of The Hunger Games. This is the amount of lines and text that you would get on roughly page 1 of a paperback. Importantly, it is the number of lines that you would get, that you would include in a printed manuscript that you would submit to an editor or agent. Of course, it's online nowadays, but page 1, 16 lines of text, very important, because You have to get your reader engaged and after those 16 lines enough to turn the page. Okay, so I'm going to read this to you. When I wake up, the other side of the bed is cold. My fingers stretch out, seeking Prim's warmth, but finding only the rough canvas cover of the mattress. She must have had bad dreams and climbed in with our mother. Of course she did. This is the day of the reaping. I prop myself up on one elbow. There's enough light in the bedroom to see them. My little sister Prim, curled up on her side, cocooned in my mother's body, their cheeks pressed together. In sleep, my mother looks younger, still worn, but not so beaten down. Prim's face is as fresh as a raindrop, as lovely as the primrose for which she was named. My mother was very beautiful once too, or so they tell me. Sitting at Prim's knees, guarding her, is the world's ugliest cat. Mashed in nose, half of one ear missing, eyes the color of rotting squash. Prim named him Buttercup, insisting that his muddy yellow coat matched the bright flower. He hates me, or at least distrusts me. Even though it was years ago, I think he still remembers how I tried to drown him in a bucket when Prim brought him home. Scrawny kitten, belly swollen with worms, crawling with fleas. The last thing I needed was another mouth to feed. But Prim begged so hard, cried even. I had to let him stay. It turned out okay. My mother got rid of the vermin, and he's a born mouser, even catches the occasional rat. Sometimes when I clean a kill, I feed Buttercup the entrails. He has stopped hissing at me. All right, we're going to talk about many of the components on that first page, which is why I read the whole thing to you. But focusing now on that first line. When I wake up, the other side of the bed is cold. Is that a great first line? Is it even a good first line? I would argue that it's not, but this is an international bestseller. It's sold millions of copies. Clearly, something about this page works. Maybe it's not the first line. Maybe the rest of the page works so well in other ways that that first line doesn't matter. But why not make your first line really good if you can? This, I'm just pointing out that it doesn't have to be in order to be successful. Now we're going to focus on the elements of character that are revealed in this first page. I won't read it to you again, but I have highlighted the parts about Katniss, the things that are about our protagonist directly on this first page. There is not very much there. She reaches for her sister when she wakes up. She tries to drown this cat. The last thing she needed was another mouth to feed. But we learn a whole lot more about Katniss than these things highlighted in orange, because the things I've highlighted in blue are things that tell us indirectly about Katniss as a character. For example, the cat has stopped hissing at her. Go ahead and tell me in the chat, what does that tell us indirectly about Katniss? The sentence is about the cat. It's directly about the cat, but indirectly, the reader infers something about Katniss. What is it? While you're thinking of that, when you're writing, you're not going to worry about this stuff. But when you're revising, check out your first page. What is it you're telling your reader? What is it you're showing your reader? What is it you're implying about your character? There's a lot of ways to convey character information. All right, well, I'll answer. I think that's telling us, the reader, that the cat has stopped hissing at Katniss. It tells me that Katniss is a good person. Animals, colloquially, we believe that they are good judges of character. So at the end of this page, despite the fact that, she tried to drown this cat, the cat has stopped hissing at her. So even though Katniss has done bad things in her life, she's a good person. That's what I think it tells us. All right, looking at setting, highlighted in green. There's not much. In fact, there's very, very little. It's definitely not like the good old days I mentioned where you've got a whole page of description. But these little details are sufficient to ground the reader in space and time, just enough so the reader's not confused, which is absolutely fine for page 1. This is a post-apocalyptic. You're going to get a whole lot more description of this dystopian society as we go on. For page 1, this is enough. Plot conflict. This is where I really hope you will interact with me and type it in the chat. I don't see a lot of plot or conflict on this page, but there is one sentence, one very powerful plot element that raises questions in the reader's minds. What do you think it is? Come on, type it in the chat. What do you think it is? Is it that she drowned the cat? Tried to drown the cat? Ah, the day of the reaping. Absolutely. That is the only thing in the entire page, in my opinion, that relates directly to the plot of the book and that raises questions in the reader's mind. What the heck is the reaping? It is, in fact, the reaping that sends Katniss on her adventure. It sends her into the Hunger Games arena and really gets the story in motion. So we don't see the reaping, that pivotal moment on the first page, but it is mentioned. Our ears perk up, the day of the reaping. Sometimes in your writing, it's not possible for you to include an element of the overarching plot of your book on page 1. It's too complicated. It's too confusing. It requires too much setup. You just can't do it. That's okay. There's another technique for getting plot on the page, for getting conflict on page 1 so that your reader turns the page to find out what happens next. It's called the bridging conflict. According to mega literary agent and storytelling guru Donald Moss, in his book, Writing the Breakout Novel, a bridging conflict is the temporary conflict or mini problem or interim worry that makes opening material matter. It is how you get plot/conflict on page 1 when you can't use your overarching plot. Let's look at an example. This novel here, The Golden Compass by Philip Pullman, it is, I'm going to tell you the story. It is the story of Lyra's journey to the Arctic to find her missing friend Roger, rescue her uncle, and learn about terrible experiments being conducted on children that involve something called dust. That is what the book is about. Now I'm going to read page 1 to you and see if you can find elements of that plot or a bridging conflict. Chapter 1, The Decanter of Tokai. Lyra and her demon moved through the darkening hall, taking care to keep to one side, out of sight of the kitchen. The 3 great tables that ran the length of the hall were laid already, the silver and the glass catching what little light there was, and the long benches were pulled out ready for the guests. Portraits of former masters hung high up in the gloom along the walls. Lyra reached the dais and looked back at the kitchen door and, seeing no one, stepped up beside the high table. The places were laid with gold, not silver, and the 14 seats were not oak benches, but mahogany chairs with velvet cushions. Lyra stopped beside the master's chair and flicked the biggest glass gently with a fingernail. The sound rang clearly through the hall. "You're not taking this seriously," whispered her demon. "Behave yourself." Her demon's name was Pantalaimon, and he was currently in the form of a moth, a brown one, so as not to show up in the darkness of the hall. "They're making too much noise to hear from the kitchen," Lyra whispered back, "and the steward doesn't come in till the first bell. Stop fussing." But she put her palm over the ringing crystal anyway, and Pantalaimon fluttered ahead and through the slightly open door of the retiring room at the other end of the dais. So let me know in the chat, what's the conflict here? What are you worried might happen? I won't ridicule you if you say a different answer than I say. You, as the consumer of this story, you can't be wrong because you're just telling me what you think the conflict was for you. Deborah says she'll be discovered. Yes, she could be discovered. That is really the only thing we're worried about. There is a whole lot of description on this page, way more than I personally like. But I read this book cover to cover. I was drawn in by this first page. And I did turn the page to see if Lyra is going to get caught by someone. That has nothing directly to do with her journey to the Arctic to find her missing friend Roger, rescue her uncle, and learn about these terrible experiments being conducted on children that involve something called dust. Nothing whatsoever. Well, not exactly nothing. See, the bridging conflict, it relates thematically to the main plot in this particular story. We're worried about Lyra getting caught when she's doing something she isn't supposed to be doing. That happens again and again in the rest of the story, while she is trying to find Roger, rescue her uncle, and learn about these experiments. She is constantly doing things. She's in places she's not supposed to be, and she's doing things she's not supposed to be doing, and we're worried that she might get caught. So while the plot element or the conflict, the tension that we feel as the reader on this page 1 isn't directly related to the plot, it is thematically related, and it is functioning as a bridging conflict that makes the first page matter enough to the reader that they turn the page. So it made me turn the page. So job well done, in my opinion, as a reader. Your opinion may vary, and we'll talk about that. So the hook. We have time to look at one more of these first page elements, and that is the hook. I mentioned earlier that a hook is something that grabs the attention of the reader and gets them to turn the page. You don't have to stress over the literary definition of this. It's super easy. It's just the thing that hooks a reader's attention and gets them to turn the page. It can be related to anything. I mentioned it's often to do with plot and conflict, as in the couple of examples we've looked at, but it could have to do with a question raised about character or about setting, about theme, even your voice, your unique voice as a writer can be enough to hook a reader into turning that page. The book pictured here is a great resource. It's called Hooked by Les Edgerton, and it's all about hooks. It's a terrific resource if you want to explore this key element a little further. Again, don't worry too much about the literary workings of it. Just trust your gut that you will know a hook when you see it. Going back to our Hunger Games example, is there a hook? If you were hooked by this, and maybe you were not, but if you were hooked by this, what hooked you? In chapter 1 of the Hunger Games, with Prim being asleep and Katniss looking at her sleeping and thinking about why she was in bed with her mother. For me, there really wasn't a hook. The first time I read this, I was bored and I set it down. I only came back to the Hunger Games book later on because I had heard from so many writers what a great story it was, and that I could learn a lot about story, and I could be really entertained by this book. So I went back to it, and I did find that there was something, one thing that hooked me. And that is, this is the day of the reaping. You might recall that this is the only sentence in the whole page that we identified as relating to any sort of conflict. So this particular hook in the Hunger Games is a conflict-related hook. But again, it could be anything that hooks you. Hooking is very subjective. And when you're writing, better yet, when you're revising your first page, don't try to hook everyone. You can't. You can't hook everyone. You're going to hook the readers who are most likely to like the rest of your book by choosing a hook that is authentic to your story and you as a writer. Don't try to put in big explosions or dinosaurs if there's no action or dinosaurs later in your story. Your reader will be disappointed. You want to hook a reader on page 1 that will enjoy the rest of the book. So figure out a hook that works for you and then test it out on readers. We call them beta readers, people who read our drafts before they get published, so that we as writers can get feedback and make those stories better. You can also try them out on your critique group, but I will caution you that your critique group probably knows your story pretty well by now, so they may not be a good judge of what is a hook to a stranger, someone new to your story. So beta readers are awesome. So hook readers with something that is authentic to your story so they will continue to be interested as the story progresses. A couple of quick cautions, things not to start your story with. Just in contemporary genre fiction writing, you don't want to start as I mentioned, with something that doesn't relate to your story. You don't want to start with coincidence, contrivance, or cliche. You don't want to start with more characters than are absolutely necessary on page 1 because it's hard for a reader to track. So introduce just a couple characters, maybe 2. Don't start with a dream. Don't start with traveling somewhere, and don't start with your character waking up. Yeah, I know that Katniss just woke up. I know that in my favorite book, Iron House, Michael just woke up. I know that people have done this, but it's become very cliche to start with a dream, or to start with waking up, or to start with taking a trip to a new place. And so readers are a little bored of that. They're a little tired of that. They think it's kind of a contrivance. Start with something more creative. Do not start with the very most important, most dramatic moment in your whole story, because that occurs much later. You got to bring the readers in, introduce them to things, hook them enough to keep going in the story. Okay, phew. Back to our overarching topic, editing and revision. I know that was a lot of really down and dirty information showing you how I revise and edit a first page. You're probably not going to do that on every page, but it gives you an example of what I would do on a first page, because remember how important that page 1 is. I know there's a whole lot to think about in revisions, and maybe you've never thought about it like that before. Maybe the biggest hurdle that you've imagined in your writing career as a new novelist is finishing a first draft. And absolutely, that is a huge accomplishment. And I don't want to take anything away from that. That is a big mountain that you have summited when you finish your first novel, the first draft. But it is not the only mountain that you have to climb. If you want to sell your book and you want strangers to read it, either via self-publishing or through a publisher, there is that second mountain, is the mountain of revision. And there's a lot of important work that you can do to make your story the best story that your story can be. But if you're feeling intimidated, don't worry. You don't have to do the revisions alone. You can enlist help. All the tools we've talked about in this entire workshop last week and today, all of these are tools that can help you during revisions. But in addition, there are lots of other sources of help. Critique groups, which I've mentioned. I haven't yet mentioned contests. There's a bazillion contests out in the world. You can look for contests that is part of your entry. Usually there's a fee, that what you receive in addition to entering into the contest where you might win a prize, you receive some feedback. Make sure you vet these contests and make sure they're legit. You don't want to get feedback that derails you and you find out it's worthless feedback anyway. Those people don't know what they're talking about. You can learn a ton about story writing in workshops like this one and at events like writers' conferences. And you can learn so much simply by reading fiction and by watching movies, as being consumers, conscious consumers of story. Plus, you can learn from nonfiction books that are geared toward writing novels. Now, on that last bullet, paid editing, I know I already talked about editors that you can hire and editors that are supplied by a publisher. This paid editing refers to you hiring what they call a freelance editor to either do developmental editing, line editing, or proofreading. Maybe all 3, maybe different people for all 3. That costs money. That may not be available to you, but maybe at some point in your career, that's something you should know is out there, that is a resource. So there's lots and lots of help available to you as you learn and grow and continue on in your journey as a novelist. Here we are, back at our list of topics. And it appears that we have covered everything on the list, at least in some way. Remembering that you can explore any or all of these on your own, and your resource list that I've provided to you as a handout is a great place to start looking for sources where you can learn more. At the very beginning of this workshop, way back at the beginning of last Saturday, I asked you to think about these 2 things. First of all, that no matter how inexperienced you might be as a novelist, you already know a lot about novel writing because you have been a lifelong consumer of stories. And that information is embedded in you. No matter what anyone tells you, no matter what I tell you about this, that is true. You know a lot. The same is true about your story. No matter what I tell you or what any quote expert tells you or what any critic tells you about your story, you know your story best, and your story should always come first. I'm not saying that you shouldn't do due diligence. I'm not saying put on blinders and completely ignore all the writing and publishing conventions and all the advice and guidelines and tools that are out there. I'm not saying that at all. I'm saying don't let those things get in the way of you telling your story. If anything comes in between you and your story, when you're drafting, when you're rough drafting, try to ignore it. Don't let it in your headspace. Write your story as only you can do, remembering that you know story, even if you don't know you know it. Then, when it comes to revision, then enlist help, seek resources, use some of the tools that I've provided, avail yourself of critique groups and that sort of thing to help you make your story the best story it can be. But it's your story. It's always your story. And don't let anyone take that away from you. A couple final tips to set you on your way as a novelist. Write. Make it a regular part of your day. It doesn't have to be every day, despite what some know-it-alls will tell you. You find your own rhythm, your own pattern, where writing is a regular, repeatable activity in your life. Keep learning as you go. I learn things every day. I've been a novelist for 30 years, and I still learn new things because I seek out that knowledge and I pay attention. Keep reading. That's often where I learn things, is by reading other people's fiction. I keep trying even when I get knocked down. So don't ever stop trying. Even though you'll have a bad day, even though you'll get a bad critique, even though you'll doubt yourself, take a deep breath, pick yourself back up and try again. It's only by trying and trying and trying that we eventually will summit that mountain. Enlist help when you need it. Novelists don't work in a vacuum. Despite us sitting at our computers alone a lot of the time, getting help from others, either other human beings, other writers, readers, resources, books, movies, whatever it is, getting that help is not only allowed, but it's fantastic. It's even, I think, necessary to my process. So even though writing is a solitary endeavor, being a writer is not a solitary existence. It doesn't have to be. And I think that those writers who are the happiest, and I'd venture to say those writers who are the most successful, they reach out outside of themselves for help on occasion. If you get stuck when you're writing, either when you're drafting or when you're revising, check your hat. Make sure you're wearing the right hat for the job. Try a different tool or technique from your toolbox that you have built during this class. Also, I wrote a book to get you unstuck. The library has copies of these that you can check out. 52 ways to get unstuck. There are literally 52 activities, exercises in this book that you can use to help you get unstuck if you get stuck writing or revising. And then my final bit of advice to you before we move to questions is write new stuff. Finish that book that you're writing. Or if you get stuck and you can't get unstuck, start a new project. When I was a new writer and I was just starting to write my first novel, it took a long time. I spent a lot of years on that first novel. And it wasn't until I got into a critique group and those wiser, more experienced souls in the group said to me, you know what? You should try writing something else. Write new stuff, because you're not the same writer you were when you first wrote that novel, your practice novel. You're better than that now. So instead of spinning your wheels going back and trying to fix that novel that was written by a much less experienced writer, start a new one. And they were right. That second novel that I wrote after writing and rewriting and revamping and re-envisioning that first novel, the first new project, that became my first published novel. And if I hadn't done that, I don't know if that practice novel, my first novel, I don't know if that ever would have been good enough to be published, because, I was just learning. I made a lot of mistakes. I'm still learning. I still make a lot of mistakes, but not as many as I did before. And I'll make fewer on my next project. So write new stuff. Deep breath now. We've covered a ton of stuff. We're also at our time for this workshop, but Melissa has said that we can stay and I can address any questions that you may have thought of during this workshop, any questions that you may have left over from last week's, or any questions at all you think I might be able to help you with along your journey as a novelist. Go ahead and type them into the chat and I will do my best to answer them. I'll just pull up this next slide while you're typing in your questions. Along those lines, as far as new things that I might be able to help you with or share, or things I might be able to explore further, I teach classes on a wide variety of writing related topics. So all the topics that we've discussed in this 4 hours of all the things you need to know to write a novel, I can teach classes on any number of topics and go more in depth into any of these things that we talked about on a surface level. So if you are interested in learning more on any of these topics, let Melissa know at PPLD. She can get in touch with me or a whole stable of other teachers that she's in touch with, and she can put us together so that we can help you learn stuff that we've learned already, and we can help guide you and assist you on your journey. So be sure to contact Melissa. She put her email address in the chat there. If you want to review any of this information that we talked about today, there is a version of this workshop as a slide deck on my website, chrismandeville.com. It is not exactly the order that we talked about today, but it hits on all the topics. And I put some notes in there to help remind you what each of the slides were about. I also have a whole lot of other resources on my website. So please check out chrismandeville.com under tips and tools for writers for more of those. So Adrian is asking, would you recommend working with a ghostwriter or a co-writer? I think that my recommendation would be different based on who I'm talking to. So if you have a story to tell and you really want to get that story out there, but you don't have confidence that your writing ability, your mechanics, your drafting ability, for any reason, maybe it's just a matter of time, that you don't think that you can write the story in the way that you want the story told, that is when you would hire a ghostwriter. Ghostwriters are professionals, they're expensive, and they write a story as best they can, making it your story that you want to tell. You still have creative control over it, but they're the ones doing the drafting. So it is not a terrible choice, depending on what your goals are. It can be a very expensive choice. And also, I want to point out that if you draft your own story, if you write the rough draft, you're going to discover things during the drafting process that you didn't know before you drafted it. So even if you're planning to have someone ghostwrite your story, it can be really helpful to you to get your thoughts together and do all that discovery process by writing the rough draft yourself. So that's as far as a ghostwriter. A co-writer is a different animal. That's somebody who is not working for you and you're not working for them. You're working on an even plane. You're both equal partners typically in a co-writing relationship. Sometimes a more experienced, more famous writer will co-write a book with a less experienced, less famous writer, and then there's a hierarchy there. it's not on equal playing field. But if you were, say, going to write a book with me, we decided we were going to be co-writers on an equal plane. We're both writing this book together. There are lots and lots of great things about working with another writer, but that writing relationship is fraught with a whole lot of dangers, a whole lot of snags and potholes, and issues can come up. Creative control can be an issue. Whose vision takes precedence can be an issue. One of my very best friends, somebody that I work with on a daily basis as a writing buddy, we don't write together. And one of the reasons we have never tried that is he used to have a writing partner, an equal partner, who he and this other man wrote together. And they produced some really amazing books. The synergy between them made the stories so much better in some ways than they would have been if either had written them alone. But it was so hard. It was emotionally and mentally taxing. In some ways, it took longer than writing a book themselves individually. And it was very damaging ultimately to their friendship. They were friends first. So if you are considering working with a ghostwriter, or you're considering co-writing with another novelist, do your research first. Don't just go based on what I say or what you see in, popular culture. Do your research as to what it entails. And if you decide to go forward, I would strongly recommend you have a very detailed contract with either of those other writers that explains in detail what the expectations, responsibilities, requirements are, including an escape clause for if it's not working, how do you get out of that contract? Yes, Adrian, there definitely could be egos in conflict when writing, and that's only one of a whole list of potential problems. For a lot of people, the benefits outweigh the risks, but know what they are, know what the potential benefits and the potential risks or problems are before you go in, so that you go in with your eyes wide open and you're not caught by surprise and you're not stuck in a relationship or a contract that is not working for you. All right, what other questions do we have? Yes, for a lot of people, co-writing is more trouble than it's worth, but for some people, it's magic. You decide for you what you think is best. And you might make a decision today that would be different from a decision that you would make next month or next year, and both could be right. So what other questions do we have about being a novelist? You can ask me about the writer's life, about my personal journey if you like. You can ask about any of the topics that we covered. Or if there's a topic that we didn't cover and you would like to bring it up, I'll do my best to answer your questions. While you're thinking of those questions, I wanted to mention that I have social media accounts on all the platforms, pretty much. I'm not on TikTok yet. But I have not been active on those social media platforms during the pandemic, just for personal reasons. I am only active right now on Facebook. So I will eventually, as my third novel is published later this year, I'll be focusing more on marketing and connecting with readers. So you'll see me become more active on those other platforms. Meanwhile, if you'd like to friend me up on Facebook, it is a personal friend account, not a Facebook page. So you don't follow me, you would friend me. So if you want to send me a friend request, be sure to send me a direct message in Messenger and just say, hey, I took your class, or we met here or there, wherever you know me from, so that I know you're a real person that I've connected with in real life, and I'm happy to friend you back. All right, any other questions? I know we've gone a little bit over, but if you have something you're dying to ask me, you have this minute, this opportunity to do that. And if not, I will tell you about my books. So Quake, Shake, and Break are my time travel series that I've mentioned a couple times. Allie is the protagonist I use as an example. She's the protagonist in all three books. Quake and Shake are published. They're available only on Amazon at this time. If you're a member of Kindle Unlimited, KU, then you can read those books for free as part of your membership. And break is I've completed the rough draft. I'm in revisions, so you know what I'm doing now. I expect that I will have this book to my editor soonish. I don't know how long it will take to get through the editing process with her, but I'm hoping that this book will be available to you by the end of this year. My post-apocalyptic Seeds is available across platform, meaning it's not exclusive to Amazon. You can get it on Amazon, but you can get it elsewhere too. And 52 Ways to Get Unstuck, my nonfiction book for writers, is also available wide. We call it wide when it's not just on one or two platforms, it's on all the platforms. Many of my books are available through the library. And if there's a book that you want to read and you can't find it through the library, let me or Melissa know so that we can make it available through Pikes Peak Library District. Deborah's asking, is Facebook the place we should be kept informed of your workshops? Yes and no. I typically try to post on Facebook what I'm going to be doing. Like I posted about this workshop a couple of times so that folks who follow me on Facebook who are interested in this type of subject could join the class. So I'll post a comment and a link. I don't do that a whole lot because if you saturate your audience with come see me do this, come see me do that, pretty soon they don't pay attention anymore. So I try to post at least once. Often those posts happen pretty close to the date that I do an event. And if you go to my website, under About the Author, there's a little subsection, Appearances, and you can find out where to spot me next. And that way you can know far in advance, for example, that I will be at the Superstars Writing Seminar here in Colorado Springs as a guest speaker in February of 2022. That's already on my calendar. Thank you for putting the link there. Right now, if you were to go to that link, you would see that I am still scheduled to be at Colorado Springs Comic-Con at the end of this month. I have not publicly announced it yet, so I have not changed it on my Facebook, but due to Delta variant of COVID and due to some family concerns related to exposure, I am going to have to withdraw from that event. I was also hoping to be at FanX in Utah next month. I don't think that's on my website, but that's another event that I will not be going to because of some family concerns. So look on my website for classes that I might be teaching online. And then as we become more and more back in the normal way of doing things, I hope to be doing some in-person events. And Melissa and I at the library, we've even talked about the possibility of doing a hybrid event where you have a speaker in person in a room physically with some members of the audience while broadcasting via a platform like this, like Zoom, so that people who aren't able to come in person could watch from their own homes. So yes, please let Melissa know what other topics you'd be interested in. For example, next week, I'm teaching a class on critique groups, and I'm demonstrating positive, affirming, helpful critique practices. That class is not available to the public because I was hired to teach it to a private group, but that's just an example of something that as you're deciding, hey, I might want to form or join a critique group, what do I need to know? Ask Melissa or send me a note via my website and we can get something set up for you. I've also written quite a few articles about these various topics. So if you learn best by reading, you can check my website for that. Lots and lots of articles. And I also put an asterisk by the items on your resource list, your handout, of things that I've written. So if the way that I teach works for you, then you might want to check out my writings on writing. All right, any other topics, questions, or issues before we say goodbye?
Thank you everyone for coming to today's session, and thank you, Chris, for all of the information you shared. I'm not a writer, but going through today, I'm like, that's why I like those kinds of books, because of the voice or the hook or whatnot. So it was even helpful to me as a reader. So thank you so much for this workshop.
If you think of a question after we say goodbye, you can always find me via the contact button on my website. I do answer all my own email and messages, so feel free to reach out and just say, hey, I was in your class and I have this question. Thanks so much for having me, Melissa. I always love teaching for the library. I love meeting other writers at any stage along the journey that you may be. I love connecting with my tribe, my writing community. So thank you all for coming.
Thank you. Have a good afternoon, everyone.
Bye,
Bye.
everybody.